The numbers tell the story before anything else does. Serbia sits on what geologists estimate is the largest untapped hard rock lithium deposit in Europe. Jadar Valley. One site, potentially 58 million tons of lithium-bearing ore, enough to supply 17% of Europe's entire projected lithium demand through 2030. One country, one valley, one deposit that changes the math of the entire green energy transition on a continent that has been begging for exactly this kind of independence for a decade. And here is what that means for you directly. Every electric vehicle sold in the United States, every battery pack installed in a European grid, every lithium-ion cell powering the devices you carry in your pocket, all of it depends on a supply chain that currently runs almost entirely through China. 68% of global lithium processing, 77% of battery cell manufacturing. The raw material under Serbian soil is not just a European story. It is a story about whether the West can build anything without Beijing's permission. Your energy future depends on how this plays out. This channel does not take corporate money. It does not answer to advertisers with stakes in the clean energy sector or to governments with diplomatic preferences. If you want analysis that follows the evidence instead of the agenda, subscribe now and turn on notifications. This story has layers that mainstream financial media is not touching. Let's go back to the beginning. Because this story did not start with a mining permit, it started with a discovery that took years to confirm and a political fight that nearly buried it permanently. Rio Tinto, the Anglo-Australian mining giant, first identified the Jadar lithium deposit in 2004. 20 years of geological surveys, feasibility studies, environmental assessments, and community consultations followed. The mineral involved is not ordinary lithium. It is jadarite, a sodium lithium boron silicate hydroxide mineral that did not exist in scientific literature before Rio Tinto found it in Serbia. It was named after the Jadar River. It is found nowhere else on Earth in economically viable quantities. The deposit itself sits beneath agricultural land in western Serbia, small farms, family plots, generations of Serbians who have worked that soil. Rio Tinto proposed a mine that would extract roughly 58,000 tons of lithium carbonate equivalent annually at peak production. That number matters. Global lithium demand in 2023 was approximately 180,000 tons of lithium carbonate equivalent. The Jadar project alone would represent nearly one-third of the entire world's current annual consumption from a single underground operation. Then the politics intervened. In January 2022, Serbia's government canceled the Jadar project's licenses under significant public pressure. Environmental protests had been building for months. Thousands of Serbians took to the streets in Belgrade and other cities. The concerns were real lithium mining produces sulfur dioxide, requires enormous water consumption, and carries contamination risks for surrounding agricultural land. The government, facing elections, made the calculation that the short-term political cost of the mine was too high. Rio Tinto's $4 billion investment evaporated overnight. The official narrative at the time said this was a victory for Serbian environmental protection, a sovereign nation protecting its agricultural heartland from corporate extraction. That was the story told to the public. Here is what the operational reality shows. Within 18 months of that cancellation, a different calculation had emerged inside the Serbian government. The European Union had passed the Critical Raw Materials Act in 2023. That legislation identified lithium as a strategic raw material and set binding targets. By 2030, the EU must be capable of producing at least 10% of its annual consumption of critical raw materials domestically. The word domestically, in EU terms, means within the European strategic orbit, which includes candidate countries like Serbia. Suddenly, the Jadar deposit was not just a mining project. It was a geopolitical asset. In July 2024, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić signed a strategic partnership agreement with the European Union and revived the Jadar project. The licenses were reinstated, Rio Tinto was back at the table, and this time, the deal came with something the original project never had: formal European backing, supply chain agreements with major automotive manufacturers, and the implicit understanding that this lithium was destined for European battery factories rather than the global spot market. Here is what they are not telling you about that reversal. The environmental concerns did not disappear. The farming communities did not suddenly agree. The protests did not end because people changed their minds. What changed was the European Union's urgency and the economic leverage attached to it. Serbia is a candidate country for EU membership. That membership represents decades of political aspiration and enormous economic consequence for a nation of 7 million people. When Brussels signals that Jadar is a strategic priority, Belgrade's government faces a different kind of pressure than domestic protesters can generate. This is not a critique of Serbia's sovereign decision. It is an observation about how geopolitical necessity reshapes domestic politics in ways that official statements never fully acknowledge. The European Union needed this lithium. Serbia needed EU membership momentum. Rio Tinto needed its $4 billion project back. 3 sets of interests aligned. The environmental assessment process was accelerated. The community consultation concerns were noted and largely set aside. Now let's talk about the technical reality of what this deposit actually means for the electric vehicle supply chain, because this is where the story gets genuinely significant. A standard electric vehicle battery pack the kind in a mid-range sedan requires approximately 8 kilograms of lithium carbonate equivalent. The Jadar project at full production would yield enough lithium annually to supply batteries for roughly 25 million electric vehicles per year. The European Union sold approximately 5 million battery electric vehicles in 2023. Even accounting for projected growth in EV adoption, Jadar alone represents a material fraction of European demand from a single domestic source. But here is the dimension almost nobody is discussing. The mine itself is only the first step in a supply chain that currently has a massive structural gap in Europe. Mining lithium produces spodumene concentrate, or in Jadar's case, a lithium sulfate solution from processing jadarite. Converting that into battery-grade lithium hydroxide, the form actually required for modern cathode chemistry, requires chemical processing plants that barely exist on European soil. China has 42 operational lithium hydroxide processing facilities. Europe has fewer than 5. Serbia has 0. The math on this is brutal. Rio Tinto has announced intentions to build an on-site lithium processing facility in Serbia that would produce battery-grade material rather than raw concentrate. That facility would cost an estimated $400 million to $600 million beyond the mine itself. Construction timelines in the mining industry run long. Environmental permits for chemical processing facilities run longer. The most optimistic projections put Jadar at full production in 2028 or 2029. That is 3 to 4 years away from meaningful output. And European automakers who have signed letters of intent for Jadar lithium are currently building battery factories on timelines that assume feedstock availability. The sequencing problem is real, and it is not being discussed honestly in the European press. Here is the number that puts all of this in context. Europe imported approximately 94% of its lithium in 2023. The continent that is mandating the electric vehicle transition, that has set 2035 as the end date for combustion engine sales sources nearly all of the foundational material for that transition from outside its borders. Most of that sourcing runs through Chinese processing, regardless of where the ore was originally extracted. A Chilean lithium mine, an Australian spodumene operation, an Argentine brine field, the concentrate travels to Chinese refineries. Then it travels back west as processed material. Europe pays margin at every step. Europe has strategic dependency at every step. Jadar, if it operates as projected, would break exactly one link in that chain, the extraction link. The processing vulnerability would remain unless the $400 to $600 million processing investment is actually built on schedule, which in European infrastructure terms is not a guarantee. Now pull back from the immediate economics and look at who is watching this situation most carefully. China has not been passive about European lithium ambitions. The strategic response has been operating on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first track is investment. Chinese battery manufacturers CATL, BYD, Ganfeng Lithium have been aggressively pursuing partnerships, investments, and in some cases direct acquisition of European battery projects and processing facilities. Cattle is building a battery gigafactory in Hungary. That factory will process materials and produce cells, but the feedstock supply chains remain heavily Chinese. Physical presence in Europe does not automatically mean European strategic independence. The second track is pricing. Chinese lithium processors demonstrated their market power throughout 2023 and 2024 when global lithium carbonate prices collapsed from a peak of roughly $80,000 per ton in late 2022 to below $15,000 per ton by late 2023. That collapse was partly demand-driven as EV adoption in some markets slowed, but it also functioned as a structural warning to Western investors considering lithium projects. At $15,000 per ton, the economics of many Western mining and processing projects become marginal or negative. Capital pulled back. Timelines extended. Rio Tinto's own internal rate of return calculations on JADAR shifted uncomfortably as spot prices fell. Beijing does not need to block JADAR. It needs only to maintain pricing pressure long enough to delay it. Russia is watching this calculation with its own set of interests. Serbia sits geographically and historically in a space of significant Russian cultural and political influence. The Serbian Orthodox Church, Slavic linguistic ties, historical diplomatic relationships, these are not abstract. Russia has maintained meaningful soft power in Serbia, even as Belgrade has pursued EU membership. An economically significant European investment in Serbian infrastructure does two things from Moscow's perspective. It ties Serbia more firmly to the Western economic orbit, which is an unfavorable outcome, but it also creates a high-value target for diplomatic friction and energy supply leverage that Russia can exploit if relations deteriorate. The broader pattern here connects to a competition that defines the next 2 decades of global industrial organization. The electric vehicle transition is not primarily a climate story. It is a supply chain story. It is a story about which industrial ecosystems control the physical inputs for the technology that will power transportation, grid storage, and consumer electronics through the second half of the 21st century. China understood this 15 years ago and built processing infrastructure, battery manufacturing capacity, and resource partnerships accordingly. The West is now attempting to reconstruct that chain under time pressure, political constraint, and the disadvantage of moving second. Serbia's JADAR deposit is genuinely significant. It is not a solution. It is a component. And the gap between a component and a functioning supply chain is precisely where the real strategic competition lives. Every German automaker with a signed agreement for JADAR lithium is simultaneously hedging with Chinese battery suppliers. Every European government celebrating the strategic partnership with Serbia is simultaneously approving imports of Chinese-manufactured battery cells for domestic energy storage projects because the domestic alternative does not yet exist at scale. The gap between political declaration and industrial reality in European critical mineral strategy is measured in years and tens of billions of euros that have not been committed. Here is what the evidence suggests will happen from this point forward. Within 18 months, Rio Tinto will publish a revised environmental impact assessment for JADAR that attempts to address the concerns raised by Serbian farming communities. That assessment will satisfy regulatory requirements in Brussels. It will not fully satisfy the communities whose land sits above the deposit. There will be continued protests. The Serbian government will proceed regardless, because the EU membership calculus and the economic investment involved will be judged to outweigh the domestic political cost of continued opposition. Within 3 years, the first construction phase at JADAR will be underway. Progress will be slower than announced timelines suggest. European infrastructure projects of this scale consistently run 18 to 36 months behind initial projections. The supply agreements signed by automotive manufacturers will be renegotiated to account for the delay. Within 5 to 7 years, JADAR will be producing lithium. Whether that lithium is processed domestically in Serbia or shipped as concentrate to processing facilities elsewhere, including potentially in China, will depend on investment decisions that have not yet been made and permits that have not yet been filed. The difference between those two outcomes is the difference between genuine European supply chain independence and a rebranded version of the same dependency. The most critical variable nobody is naming explicitly is whether Europe builds processing capacity fast enough to absorb JADAR's output on its own terms. If it does not, the mine opens, the ore moves, and Chinese processors remain the indispensable link. The extraction becomes European. The value addition remains Chinese. That outcome would represent the most expensive and politically complicated way to change almost nothing about the fundamental strategic picture. The countries studying this most closely are not France or Germany. They are Morocco, Kazakhstan, and Indonesia nations with their own critical mineral deposits, watching how Serbia navigates the tension between environmental concerns, community rights, foreign investment, and great power competition. The template Serbia sets will be referenced in capital cities across the developing world as their own resource negotiations proceed. What burned away in Jadar Valley in 2022 was not just a mining license. It was the assumption that democratic opposition to extraction projects could override geopolitical necessity in the new industrial order. What replaced it was the European Union's explicit statement that lithium independence is a strategic priority that member and candidate states are expected to support. That is a significant shift in how the bloc exercises economic sovereignty over its neighbors. Here are my 3 predictions with the clock attached. First, by mid-2027, Jadar will face at least one additional significant legal or regulatory challenge from Serbian civil society that forces a 3 to 6 month pause in early construction. The opposition is organized, internationally connected, and operating within legitimate legal frameworks. This delay will not stop the project. It will cost Rio Tinto and its European partners between $200 million and $400 million in carrying costs and timeline adjustments. Second, within 4 years, at least one Chinese entity, either directly or through a European intermediary, will have a meaningful investment stake in either Jadar's processing operations or in a competing Serbian mineral project. The access point will be financial rather than political, structured as a minority investment or offtake agreement that passes European regulatory scrutiny while embedding Chinese supply chain presence. Third, by 2030, Europe will have reduced its lithium import dependency from approximately 94% to somewhere between 70 and 78%. That progress will be real. It will also fall short of the EU's stated targets. The political response will be to extend the deadlines rather than acknowledge that the critical mineral strategy was built on optimistic timelines that the industrial reality could not match. The gap between political ambition and industrial execution is the defining story of the Western energy transition. Serbia's lithium is a genuine asset. The question is whether the institutions competing to use it are moving fast enough, honestly enough, and with sufficient industrial commitment to turn that asset into actual independence. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does Europe hit genuine lithium independence by 2030, or does the processing gap keep Chinese supply chains indispensable regardless of what gets mined in Serbia? Tell me, because I read every single one. If this gave you a framework for understanding the electric vehicle transition that goes beyond the press release, a way to separate the announcement from the industrial reality, share it with one person who is trying to make sense of the energy transition story. They will not get this from the financial press. The next video goes somewhere even this one did not reach. Subscribe so you are there when it lands.